Russia wages a total war against Ukraine, trying to ruin its culture, future, and metaphysics of freedom, dignity, and sovereignty. Today, we are unleashing the matter of how democracy withstands authoritarian aggression and the deep-rooted difference between Ukraine's regime and Russia's one. You're listening to the podcast Explaining Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher, journalist, and chief editor of UkraineWorld. In this episode, my colleague Daria Synhaievska, analyst and journalist at UkraineWorld, is joined by Lucan Way, professor of political science at the University of Toronto, co-director of the Petro Yatsyk Ukrainian Studies program at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, researcher of the evolution of political regimes in post-Soviet countries. Explaining Ukraine is a podcast by UkraineWorld, an English-language website about Ukraine. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. Let me remind you that you can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode.
Dear Lucan, welcome and thank you for joining.
Well, happy to be here.
So, war is a point of changes, and I want us to try, to grasp what does it do with political regimes, sources of sustainability of those, and we will perhaps discuss some post-war prospects, including your new research on the relationship between economies and political regimes. But as for now, many studies have shown that Ukraine and Russia have been moving in different political trajectories since the early 2000s, and Ukraine was leaning towards a more democratic system, while Russia was gradually returning to authoritarian rule. And this divergence was primarily explained by the fact that Ukraine was had a more democratic political culture than Russia. So what's your point of view? What are Ukraine's and Russia's different paths?
Absolutely. So Russia is now, clearly a full-scale autocracy, whereas Ukraine is a democracy. I mean, to put it simply, and I think that's, both Ukraine has from the very beginning been much more competitive than Russia has. Russia has not had a single turnover from incumbent to opposition in its since the collapse of the Soviet Union, whereas Ukraine, if I'm remembering correctly, has had about 5 turnovers in 1994, and then in other years. So that's one indicator. It's not the only indicator of democracy, but basically, opposition has won power multiple times in Ukraine's history since independence. So that's I think that's sort of the biggest, the most obvious difference.
What strikes me the most that we had some, competitive authoritarianism during Kuchma reign, but if we talk about some robust, autocracy, it's not the case for Ukraine. And we can say that in our terms, this strive for democracy led us to competitive politics. And it is interesting that at a time when Ukraine is at war, we do not have, a large-scale discourse about the possibility of Ukraine becoming an authoritarian state. This is evidenced by the lack of demand in society for so-called strong hand, consistent support, I would say, for human rights, and the alien ideas of unconditional obedience. So there are, I guess, structural and institutional factors which indicate a low probability of establishing an authoritarian regime in Ukraine. Because basically, in my view, authoritarianism is like a social political construct in which obedience to power is achieved through, a certain level of public consent, leaders' charisma, or, some repressive apparatus of the state. And in Ukraine, we witness a symptomatic story of, disillusionment with leaders and accordingly a demand for something more new and sometimes out of the system. because, for example, Zelensky was perceived as a figure out of the system that can breathe new life. And we also bear in mind the legacy of the three largest waves of anti authoritarian protests in Ukraine, like in 1990, 2004, and 2014. So, yes, I totally agree with you. But to your opinion, why Ukraine will not turn into this authoritarian regime, and what are the sources of sustainability?
Well, I think we should never be confident that this is not going to happen in the future. I mean, my own home country of the United States, one would have never thought that democracy would be under threat in the United States of any country in the world, and it clearly is under threat right now. So I don't think it's right to say that that there isn't a danger of democracy. I mean, of authoritarianism in Ukraine. I mean, I think any politicians, all in my view, have some kind of seed of authoritarianism in them, for the simple reason that have enough, if you think you are you are able to run a country or represent a country, you're willing to invest as much time and energy to sort of become leader of a large country, then almost by definition you are not going to want to give up power. So I think every democratic leader has a seed of authoritarianism in them, some more than others. So I always think it's a danger. And I certainly think that, I think, if you look, I've written a book on the sources of Ukrainian democracy, and I think there are, one should always be concerned that we should not think that somehow, the kind of somehow that some Ukrainian culture is inherently undemocratic, whereas Russian culture is inherently democratic, authoritarian, or the other way around. I think that there's always a danger, and certainly the war has hurt Ukrainian democracy but for reasons that are completely understandable, and hopefully, I think probably temporary. But I think the most obvious thing is that Zelensky has rightfully uh, postponed elections. That's understandable, but obviously not ideal. So I think there always is a danger of authoritarianism.
Yes, you're absolutely right, and we should be, on this call of duty that yes, democracy is something that has to be preserved, and there must be a rule of law that will, somehow navigate among what is right in terms of democracy and what is not. But if we talk about sources, what sparkles in my mind when I was thinking about this topic is that democracy was born out of the competition of ideas and the distribution of power. And in the cauldron of ideas, different intellectual traditions exist. For example, if we think about Hetman Skoropadsky, he was a monarchist, while Simon Petlura was a left-wing politician. Mikhailo Dragomanov is one who laid this intellectual foundations of Ukrainian democracy as he advocated for this liberal values and social equality, personal freedom, like civil rights. So, I mean, the Ukrainian democratic movement was also continued by dissidents who had been released from Soviet Gulag, and the heritage of ideas which Moscovites often tried, to drown in blood, was fought for and preserved. So we should keep an eye on democracy. But I was more talking about the idea that the history, the intellectual history of the idea of democracy, is like inherently there. And it's not only about ideas. We can also look at institutions. For example, in Soviet times, despite the fact that the Republican model of administration was preserved, the formal leaders of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, I mean, the first secretary of the Communist Party and the head of the government, they didn't have actual power because they were responsible for implementing what the policies were chosen in Moscow. And the Republican leadership also lacked control over the material resources. And maybe that will be a link to the book about the basically economy and regimes, but a little bit later. So it played at best the role of such, intermediary between the Ukrainian people, Ukrainian nation, Ukraine as such, and Moscow. So when the old Soviet nomenclatura created the office of the president in 1992, it looked up to the model of the first secretary of the Communist Party, a politically weak figure. So as a result of this system, the new Verkhovna Rada in independent Ukraine was fragmented but institutionally strong, and the figure of the president was weak, and the government having great powers over the president. So maybe you see other sources of this idea of democracy in Ukraine, because you mentioned it.
No, I think it's possible that ideas have some impact. Although I actually really have a hard time understanding exactly how that would play out. I think it has much more to do with the distribution of resources. So, the question is, can any leader monopolize control over political and economic resources? And one of the reasons, interestingly, about Ukraine, if you look at why it was so competitive in the last 30 years, was because of regional differences, right? So, no single, regional power could concentrate political control. They were unable to concentrate control over the economy or over politics. So you had sort of a basically turnover between politicians with a support base, more in the West versus ones more in the East. This is a well known, and a lot of people talk about that. So I think that sort of, perhaps there's some connection to the Cossacks or the others, but I don't really see how that plays out in today's politics. I don't. But I think it has much more to do with, can politicians monopolize control over political and economic resources? And I think certainly the diminution, the reduction of regional divisions within Ukraine, they probably still exist, is actually, in my mind, somewhat of a danger for Ukrainian democracy. And I think the sort of regional divisions kind of fostered a kind of pluralism and made it really hard to monopolize political control. So I think, in the post-war era, I think I don't think Ukraine is going to become an autocracy, but I think, at least when I think of what were the sources of pluralism in Ukraine before 2014, those have changed dramatically, which is, this regional division. So I think there, really is a potential danger we have to sort of keep a lookout.
And maybe you were thinking about, mechanism for preventing this, for, staying pluralistic as we are, and at the same time keep an eye on the democratic development. Because, yes, for some reasons there are regional peculiarities, but they are in, for example, Spain or Belgium, United Kingdom, or the US. So I mean, it's okay for regions to differ in some way, but it's not necessarily will lead to some cleavage or something that will distort the country. So maybe you can dwell on more.
Well, I think the cleavages are good. I don't think they're bad. They're in fact what makes establishing autocracy much harder. So I think we tend to oftentimes. I mean, I think that cleavages were considered bad by Ukraine because people thought that by saying there were cleavages, it was a dysfunctional country. But that cleavages were essential to Ukrainian pluralism, and if they go away, I think there's that's a real danger for Ukrainian democracy. And and I think civil society has become quite strong. So I think that democracy is likely to survive the war. But I think that's something to watch out for.
It's an interesting idea because, yes, I understand what you mean, because it may lead to uniformity without some visible differences. But I guess in Ukrainian context, we are all, in the place of 2004, when some Russian propagandists and politicians made maybe you remember the map of three sorts of Ukrainians unions and such stuff when trying to split the nation. So I guess it's important to preserve that difference, but yes, watch out for some exported political views on these differences. And another question that keeps me preoccupied is that some people believe that after Putin's reign is over, Russia will collapse. What's your view on that?
I think that is wishful thinking. I think that's. I mean, so I was just in Ukraine a few weeks ago, and I can certainly understand why many in Ukraine would want Russia to collapse as a country. I would, want the same thing. I don't see any chance of that. I think that's complete fantasy. I think there's just no reason to think that Russia, is going to collapse. If I were Ukraine, I would definitely, root for any kind of regional separatist movements in the various autonomous republics, because that would, take military force Russia to divert military resources to those regions. I think that's good for Ukraine. But the idea that there's going to be a collapse of Russia the way there was a collapse of the USSR in 1991, I think is total fantasy. That is not going to happen.
Maybe you can dwell on more of White's fantasy, and maybe what then you see the future of some separatist movements inside Russia in the future, maybe because there are different nations that are melted in this part of Russian imperial politics, and maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Well, it's fantasy because the reason why the USSR split up so easily in 1991 is blindingly simple. You had Boris Yeltsin in Russia, who was in competition with Mikhail Gorbachev, who was the president of the USSR, and he wanted the system to collapse. So, of course, if the biggest republic within the USSR wanted to collapse, it would happen very quickly. There is nothing equivalent right now in Russia. There's no one in Moscow is going to push for the collapse of the Russian Federation. So that's sort of the obvious reason. I think that the reason why separatist movements are unlikely to succeed, again, I mean, I for Ukraine's sake, I root for them. Although I think it would be awful for the members of that those republics. Just simply because the Russian military is going to be far more powerful than any sort of military within the various ethnic republics, and so it's just so they're almost certainly going to fail.
Hmm. I was also thinking about maybe structural definition of why it's not going to happen, because while you were sharing your insight, I recalled the book of Mr. Aslund on his Russia's crony capitalism, and he basically said that Russia's power structure is based on KGB networks, friends in state-owned enterprises like business circles, because well, there is a variety of them, like Gennady Timchenko, Arkady Rotenberg, owners of Novatek, I mean, Gazmontaj and Rossiya Bank, so and offshore companies. So basically, this four-fold structure maintains the power in Russia, and I guess it's hard to melt this structure, or somehow the structure is not that easy to disperse. So we maybe can expect of some movements that you described, but I totally agree with you that the collapse of Russia is not foreseeable. But at the same time, that leads us to another question: when Putin is over, the pluralism by default scenario is not the case, but can we assume the variation in this disorganization of different authoritarian diaspora networks, for example?
Yeah, no, I think for Ukraine, I think it would. I'm not sure that as you kind of indicated, that Russia will become a democracy if Putin falls. But I think right now in Russia, you have a very personalist system of power. where the power really rests on a single individual, and there were almost no checks on his authority, which I think partly explains his decision to invade Ukraine. That did not have certainly universal support within the BPK, within the military-industrial complex, or within oligarchs. This was kind of a decision by Putin alone, which had some resonance in popular opinion, the sort of anti-Ukrainian sentiment within many Russians. But I think that's an indication of the fact that his power is very concentrated in a single individual of Putin. So if when he eventually dies, then I think that the Russian system will be sort of potentially at least in crisis. But I think the state is sufficiently strong and power is sufficiently concentrated that I don't really see much chances of a kind of pluralism by default in Russia. I think it'll be good for Ukraine because I think I'm guessing it's so hard to tell exactly from the polls that the war in Ukraine is not very popular in Russia, and so. But in that a big reason why it continues is because Putin obviously has invested so much of his authority in this war, and so I think that if he leaves the scene, then that will be allow for someone else to sort of wash their hands of it, and at least stop active conflict. Obviously no leader of Russia is going to give up, unfortunately, Mariupol or Crimea or whatnot. That will have to be gained through military means. But I think it would definitely be good for peace in Ukraine if Putin dies.
Yes, it's interesting insight on basically what the just peace means, and basically the idea is that there is no political opposition in Russia because there are no discussions on not waging the war. It's about how to wage it. Why Russia didn't attack in a full scale back in 2014, or what Russia had to do with Georgia, etc. So it's not about creating, it's about destruction. And Putin's attack on Ukraine is an attack on the entire free world because if the aggressor is not stopped, the evil will try to spread. And now let's talk about how Ukraine enhances democracy. Democracy won a great victory in the Second World War, and the post war model of democracy in Europe was based on a number of key characteristics like the assertion of the authority of nation state, the parliaments elected by direct elections, the culture of coalition rule, and so on. And now, as you highlighted, that Putin invested so much effort, I see that Putin needed this a small victorious war to demonstrate his strong hand to Russians and divert attention from internal crisis. And this didn't happen. And it is also noteworthy that Russians, tend to live and to think about the past, while Ukrainians try to look to the future and to invest for future generations amid even the ongoing full-scale war. So, to your opinion, what challenges will democracy face after the Russian war? Maybe you have insights based on your new project, which is being prepared for publication, in which you explore the sources of democracy's sustainability in the modern world.
Yeah, no, I think that basically, this book focuses on the fact that high income countries with highly developed capitalist systems are almost universally democratic. There are right now 53 high income countries, according to World Bank measures, in the world. 51 of those are established democracies. So having a highly developed capitalist system is almost a guarantee right now of democracy. And Ukraine is a more kind of middle income country, so it could really go either way. It's less clear, at least on that level, that Ukraine will become a democracy. I think here, I have to say, looking at, I've just written a piece for Journal of Democracy on the postponement of elections in Ukraine. And one of the interesting things I found was that, first of all, obviously, I think I don't need to convince anyone who's listening to this that the decision to delay elections in Ukraine is completely justified. There are almost no democracies that have held elections when war is going on their territory. So that is, completely justified. At the same time, what I actually found interesting from my visit to Ukraine is that despite the fact that Ukraine is under martial law, and despite the fact that elections have been postponed, there is a remarkable amount of pluralism, right? The media, there have been some restrictions connected to the martial law, but media is very active in terms of highlighting opposition forces, in terms of, there's opposition parties are allowed to function freely. Parliament, while it's weaker than before the war, still plays an important role. For example, of course, in the passage of the mobilization law in April, when there were close to 4,000 amendments. So this is, despite everything, a remarkably pluralist country, even though the war has forced kind of sort of reduction of democracy in certain key areas.
Yes, for sure. Basically, I want to reflect on the thesis that it's fully justified why Ukraine cannot hold elections now, because basically we cannot secure the free and open voting on the front line, and we cannot, push our nation to such a challenge posed by Russia. And well, my opinion is that democracy should function under the rule of law, clearly, and that's maybe another thing Ukraine is fighting for the disputes to be resolved through rule of law, which is not known for Russia, and not through the rule of power, let's call it such way. So I guess maybe you can agree or disagree with me that that might be the challenge in the post-war era, the challenge of maintaining rule of law as the final voice in disputes, in order not to deepen this, and in order not to wage this war with authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes, which have different perceptions of Geneva conventions, when for example Ukraine adheres this principles, and Russia, when we have a number of recordings when this convention was violated by Russia. So maybe you can agree or disagree with me on this matter.
I mean, I definitely, if you mean by the rule, I think rule of law is definitely one of those things that sort of definitely strengthens democracy. You also have, but you do have cases where the rule of law is weak, and there are democracies, but they tend to be relatively short-lived. So I would agree with that. At the same time, I think it's remarkable that Ukraine has not had more, at least that we know about, any violations of the Geneva Conventions, given the circumstance. At the same time, you can have democracies that do violate Geneva Conventions. Look at Israel, which is clearly a democracy, but has engaged in all sorts of war crimes. So, at least according to the International Court of and according to the International Criminal Court. So, but I think it is remarkable that that Ukraine, despite everything, has treated prisoners of war so well. I mean, given the sort of very natural desire for revenge, I think that's really quite remarkable and speaks well to Ukraine.
Hmm. And you also mentioned that during your last visit to Ukraine, you saw a number of, pluralism in Ukraine. Maybe you can see how the war that is unleashed by Russia could enhance democracy, how paradoxical it may sound.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the war enhances. I think it makes democracy much harder. And so, I think I think there are problems with democracy. I think the fact that uh, certain television programs were taken off the main digital network, I think was a problem. I think the sort of telemarathon has certain problems with it. I think the sort of certain studies have shown that sort of commentators tend to be pro-government, and I think that's not great. But this is all within. I mean, given at the same time, given the fact that Ukraine faces an existential threat, I think that the fact that opposition is allowed to function freely, and the fact that sort of even on telemarathon there are still many opposition voices, I think is remarkable. So I think still think it's despite the war. I don't think if anything the war. I mean, in any country, war always threatens democracy. But
Yeah, for sure. I meant that when Ukraine wins this war, I guess this will be, the triumph of democracy, because Ukraine is supported by so many democratic states, European Union, the United States, and many others. So I was, thinking in that surely we are witnessing this barbarous invasion, and surely we are, living to our fullest despite this war of destruction, its totality. But when we win this war, it will be, the triumph of this rule of law, which is the challenge now, but hopefully will turn for the better. Thank you. And I was joined by Lucan Way, bright political scientist and intellectual, professor at Political Science Department at the University of Toronto, co-director of the Petro Yatsyk Ukrainian Studies program at the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. Thank you, Lucan, and thanks to our supporters.
Thank you. That was a great conversation.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. In this episode, my colleague Daria Synhaievska, analyst and journalist at UkraineWorld, spoke with Lucan Way, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. You can also support our volunteer trips to the front lines areas at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting, gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.